Hello and welcome to this episode of Block Party. I'm Nic Cary, the co-founder and vice chairman of blockchain.com, and today I am joined by an old friend, Perianne Boring, founder of the Digital Chamber and one of the most influential voices at the intersection of blockchain technology, public policy, regulation, and financial innovation. Perianne, you have spent more than a decade helping bring together industry leaders and policymakers to shape the future of digital assets in the United States and beyond. And we're currently in a time where crypto is no longer just a niche, nerdy thing like it was over a decade ago, but a core question to the future of finance and how we're going to upgrade the financial systems of the world. So we're really excited to get your perspective and views on that, especially from someone that's been really at the epicenter of that policy discussion. So a little funny fact about you, I think you came from journalism and you worked at sort of the intersection of journalism, public policy, geopolitics, and were sort of breaking stories early in your career. When did you first learn about blockchain technology and what sort of triggered that? Oh, there's a lot going on here and there's something I'm much more interested in.
Yeah, Nick, thanks. It's great to be here on the block party. I think the last time I saw you was at a party,
Oh
the
God.
the crypto ball, which I was pregnant at. So it wasn't. I did not have as much fun as everybody else, unfortunately. I
I
feel
took
like I
that
need.
night sober too. It was just the whole thing was like impressive and awkward at the same time. So it
It
was a
was
heck of a
so
night though.
bizarre. It was on one hand, there's like Snoop Dogg doing a rap concert, and then like the incoming Secretary of the Treasury standing next to me at the bar. I have like a pregnant belly. I just want a glass of champagne. Those things don't look good together. So it was definitely the party of the decade for me. But I couldn't enjoy it as much as everybody else. So my background and my interest is really in monetary policy and financial policy. I grew up in a small town in Lakeland, Florida, and I was studying economics during the 2008 economic crisis, which impacted everybody I knew, my friends, my family, every business that I knew of. It had a big impact on people. And I really wanted to understand what happened. As a student of economics, wouldn't that be a good use of my time at school to understand what the heck is happening in my own community? And really, our professors could not answer the questions. And I still have my macroeconomics textbook, which was written by, at the time, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. And, the supply and demand graphs just really weren't cutting it for a clear explanation. And the only person that could answer some basic questions about what the heck is happening was this doctor who was running for president, who was Dr. Ron Paul. And he really gave, I think, only the most like clear and coherent explanation of what was happening in the economy. And I became part of the Ron Paul revolution. I was like very much obsessed with him for like in my early days, and wanted to contribute to the work he was doing in Washington. So I applied to be a White House intern. I was the only person from Florida during the semester I was in the White House. That was during the Obama administration. I worked in the National Economic Council of Advisors as an intern. My job was help track TARP stimulus funds, which I wasn't a huge proponent of, and really got to see inside the belly of the beast of how the bailouts happened, who got them, who didn't get them, what exactly was happening in Washington, between Washington and Wall Street. And a lot of that was quite controversial and things that I felt we could do better as a nation. So I decided to dedicate my career to public policy. After I finished my internship and graduated from college, I moved to DC. I worked on Capitol Hill as a legislative aide in the US House of Representatives. And that is where I learned about Bitcoin. So I decided to go work in the House because that's where Dr. Ron Paul was. I didn't work in his office, but I got to work in a fellow Republican office. And I did a lot of work supporting his signature pieces of legislation, like in the Fed and audit the Fed and competing currencies, and was part of the coalition to get support for all that. So I kind of had a bit of a name for myself on the Hill as like this libertarian, pro free markets, limited government, fix the money, fix the world conversations that were happening pre Bitcoin. And I had a very intelligent friend who was much smarter than me that came across Bitcoin at some point in time, who just said, hey, this Bitcoin thing, given how interested you are in monetary systems and fixing the monetary system, this just might be a technology I think you would be interested in. And of course, he was right. I was very excited by Bitcoin when I first learned about it. And that was in 2010 timeframe. So really very, very early. I'm not a technologist. I actually sent the white paper to my dad, who's a software engineer, and had him explain it to me. And he explained the double spend problem and how that was a real issue in computer science and how they actually did figure out that issue and that this was a real technical leap and an advancement, and the technology was solid. But for me, it was more about an opportunity to fix the money and having technology available for everyday people to have an alternative to central economic planning. And I spent several years studying it on my own and following this space independently. I later was recruited into journalism. I worked for RT America, which is the Russia Today news network, which is quite interesting. Probably a story for a different podcast of how I ended up in the whole experience being an American working at a Russian news company. But it is the second largest news network in the world, and it was a huge opportunity. And I had my own finance program, and that's when I met you, Nic, because I was one of the only people. I think I was the first international broadcast journalist that had Bitcoin as a regular beat on their show. And I went to the very first Bitcoin conference ever in San Jose, California in 2013. I was the only person that showed up with a camera. I think I interviewed you. I interviewed Charlie Shrem. I interviewed all the greats at that event. And then I also had the opportunity to cover a lot of the early stories that were so exciting in the Bitcoin space, which included blockchain.com's original fundraising and financing. I forget what the exact numbers were, but I think you guys maybe did a $30 million raise. You followed it by a much larger one.
Really good.
Yeah. So I got to break some big stories. I did yours. I did Bitco's financing and a number of others. And it was an exciting time. And seeing a lot of really smart and young people raising real money to use this technology to improve money, to improve the financial system, that was something really incredible. And after spending a year working for this Russian company, 1 year was enough for me. I ended up not renewing my contract for, again, a conversation for a different podcast and probably a stiff drink. I ended up leaving media and I started the Digital Chamber, which is now 12 years old, or will be turning 12 later this summer. But I wanted to put my focus into advocating for this technology. I do feel the promise of Bitcoin, the promise of digital assets is to fix the money and fix the world, and advocating for its acceptance and use. And that's where I've spent my time, my passion, my resources over the past decade plus.
Wow, I am so glad you told us that story. I didn't know a lot of pieces of that, including your dad sort of bringing the technical lens to the white paper. And we've watched a lot of fascinating early stories from the industry sort of get planted, grow, and mature. For those that don't know, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is designed in Washington essentially as an organization to advocate on behalf of U.S. enterprises. And the Digital Chamber was sort of its next iteration. And I think, Perianne, you get a lot of credit for raising the profile of the industry on the world stage, and it would not have happened without you. And I can see how your early experiences in your career were all just sort of the building blocks for founding and building the Digital Chamber, which is so cool. Okay, well, funnily enough, I was a precinct coordinator for the Ron Paul campaign, so we share more than a few things in common. But he was one of the first people, I agree, that sort of are diagnosed and articulated the malaise in the American economy. And the problem was that we have been using a monetary system that is essentially the ideology of a cancer cell. It grows in perpetuity. It constantly creates inflation. It devalues people's savings, and it perpetuates all kinds of perverse incentives. And it's not a right or left problem. It's an everybody problem that is like a hidden tax. And unless you face the reality of that, they're going to continue to have, enormous budget deficits, runaway spending, all kinds of programs that one side or another may not like, but whoever's in control gets basically access to this purse that just has an unlimited supply of money in it. And so if you want to have a realistic conversation, no household could ever run their finances that way without going bankrupt. And yet we somehow forgive it at a federal level. So anyway, I was a really, he also really kind of took me down this path of learning more about, how money is created, where it comes from, the consequences of all of that. So anyway, let's pivot a little bit, because this has obviously been a huge year in Washington, D.C. when it relates to public policy. And it's been a little while since I've taken a civics class, and maybe you can help us understand how laws get created, and then specifically in the crypto space, how we got two very important pieces of legislation. One has already been passed, and the second one, the Clarity Act, has recently been sort of endorsed by the Senate Banking Committee and is going to the Senate, but it is not a foregone conclusion. Can you give us a little bit of a run of show for those that don't remember their 101 Constitution class? How do you get rules passed in Washington, D.C.?
Well, even if you ace your civics class, you probably don't, unless you've been inside the belly of the beast. It probably doesn't do justice of how things actually get done, at least today. And our founding fathers created a system that has a logjam in it, and it's very purposefully was built to make it very difficult to make new laws. And that was to limit the size of government and the scope of government. So I just kind of have to appreciate that it is quite difficult. So members of Congress, we have House and Senate, the lower and the upper chamber. There's 435 House members, 100 members of the Senate, for a total of 535 members of Congress. A bill can originate out of either chamber. Both chambers have to pass the bill independently. They have to pass the same bill independently out of their own chambers. And then once that happens, it goes to the president's desk for signature. Now, there's a lot of politics that happen in that process. So we'll just use the Clarity Act, which is the crypto market structure legislation, to kind of talk through what exactly is happening with that bill today. This bill started over 8 years ago. It originated in the House Agriculture Committee, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Digital assets like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and many others are commodities. They're not securities. So it's really the CFTC that has primary jurisdiction over digital assets. That's why this conversation originated from the Agriculture Committee. It was very clear a very long time ago that we needed clear rules to the road, defining which digital assets are considered a commodity and which one are a security, putting that in the book so businesses know who their regulator is. They understand what the rules to the road are, so their businesses can operate in a legally compliant way without the threat of enforcement over their head. The Biden administration really exploited that and turned that into a very, very untenable operating environment. I mean, they tried to kill the industry. They were almost completely successful at that. Many businesses went out of business, or they closed down, or they left the country altogether because they did not have a clear regulatory environment, and regulation by enforcement was really out of control by the federal regulators. So having that ambiguity of, well, okay, if you're doing business with Ethereum or Solana or pick your cryptocurrency, we're not going to tell you if that currency is a security or not. You're going to have to guess. And if you guess wrong, we're going to come after you. And that was really the guiding principle of the Biden administration towards crypto. And they were extremely effective in trying to slow this industry down, try to slow the uptake of the technology down. And I think that's still a huge threat that faces our country if we do not get the Clarity Act passed into law. So putting into statute, clarifying which agencies have jurisdiction over which digital assets, was really, again, the biggest thing that was used to try to drive the industry offshore. That ended up being extremely effective. So if we can get that into law, then that issue won't be an issue in the future. And it future proofs the work that's happening at the agencies today. So the bill originated in the House a number of years ago. Fast forward to today, we have a House version, we have a Senate version. In the Senate, we have a banking committee version, we have an ag committee version. The banking committee version of the bill passed committee. It made it through its markup a couple of weeks ago. That still has to be reconciled with what the ag committee is doing. Again, the ag committee oversees CFTC, the banking committee oversees SEC. So together, an SEC CFTC provides the regulatory clarity that's most critical for the digital asset industry. So that work of consolidating banking and ag committees, respective pieces of legislation still has to happen. Once that happens, it will go through those committees and make its way to the floor for a vote. The House then has to take up the same bill. Today, they have a different bill. So hopefully they will take the bill the Senate is hopefully going to pass and bring it to the floor. But what the House worked on and what the Senate worked on is different text. So there's a little bit of a risk there of, could there be some politics? Could there be some additional negotiating? If the House doesn't accept the Senate version, it's got to go through, all those chambers and all those committees all over again. Assuming all of that can be reconciled, if we can get a bill through both chambers in the next weeks or months, then it will go to the president's desk. We are hearing that the president wants to sign the bill on July 4th. So I think he's expecting all that work to be done by then. Hopefully Congress can get all their ducks in a row. Only one thing I learned when I worked on Capitol Hill is a lot of legislation is political theater. It's not ever going to become law. In fact, only 2% of legislation that's introduced actually becomes law. It's very, very, very hard to get a bill through that whole process. The most important thing is to have a legislative pathway in place. You have to have the right people in the positions of power in the congressional leadership that are going to drive the bill through the legislative process. And if you don't have that, the bill's not going anywhere. We do have a process established. I do believe leadership is focused, but there's a lot of competing priorities. We now have a new war happening. There's other things going on that demand Congress's attention. So keeping leadership focused on getting the bill done is what is most critical and what everyone's spending the majority of their time on right now in the policy space.
Wow. Thank you for running us through that whole orientation. I felt like I was back in my constitutional law class from a few decades ago. What does this practically mean if you had to translate it to everyday American crypto holders, and maybe kind of explain what this sort of sets as like a precedent globally? Because what Washington does echoes around the world. Like, what's at stake?
Yeah, and that is a big and major point. Is DC is a leader in global financial services regulations, and many other countries are waiting for what the US is going to do and going to follow suit. And a lot of the crackdowns we saw around the world were because that's what the US was doing under a previous administration. So Washington does set the tone around the world. It's really important we get it right. And in Washington, D.C. So as I mentioned, that regulatory clarity issue was exploited by an administration that didn't like crypto, wanted to shut it down, wanted to push the industry overseas. Our agencies, our regulatory agencies, do have the statutory authority to provide that regulatory clarity today, and they have. So we have a pro-crypto administration with President Trump sitting at the top. The people he has put in place to lead the CFTC and the SEC are both pro-crypto. They have already put forward regulations that say this is where our jurisdiction is, this is where it ends. They're coordinating amongst those two agencies, and the industry largely has that clarity today. The problem is what if we have another president that's elected in the future who reverts back to an anti-crypto stance and again wants to shut the industry down? And then they have new people at the regulatory agencies that could then just reverse everything that the Trump administration has done. That is the risk. And so by having legislation passed, that future proofs that work. It's a lot more difficult to undo legislation because, again, you have to go through that very complicated process of getting a bill through all the chambers and their respective committees and to the president's desk versus the agencies operating within their jurisdiction. So it is in the industry's best interest to have the legislation done so it's solidified in statute forever versus not having it. But we technically don't have to have it to have the clarity. It just helps preserve that for future administrations.
Got it. Super helpful. I wanted to obviously this there's a lot of powerful perspectives in this conversation. I think just last week Jamie Dimon was on Fox News and used a rather blunt word to describe his point of view related to the Clarity Act. And I just wanted to get your take on, financial institutions have been using lobbying for decades to solidify and entrench themselves. And, they pay billions of dollars in fines every year for violating all kinds of different rules. And so, what the crypto industry has been really trying to do is get an even playing field, rules clarified to offer the products and services that they've developed that are in many ways already curing some of the problems that the legacy financial institutions inherently have because of all kinds of inherent challenges within their own business models, rent-seeking behaviors, a lack of transparency, walled gardens around the technology, high fees because everything's expensive to reconcile. And what crypto has done is basically built an alternative, better mousetrap that's better, cheaper, faster, has digital privacy and, sort of efficiencies baked into it. And so I just wondered if you had 2 seconds to spend, whispering into Jamie Dimon's ears, what would you say, if anything, or would you just be like, hey, see you on Congress, see you on the Hill?
Well, I haven't met Jamie Dimon, but it would be great to meet him. What would I say? I'd have to think about that. Politics is a very messy business. I can't say it's a career choice I would recommend. A lot of this behavior is quite predictable. And I think, you get it, Nick. At the end of the day, what crypto blockchain technology provides is a much cheaper, faster, more secure way to move money and assets around the world on a digital platform. The financial institutions, particularly the banks, correspondent banks, which I think JP Morgan is the largest correspondent bank in the world, that's how they make their money. There's a $2 trillion industry to collect fees of just moving our money around. We pay banks to do that today. If you're paying a bill, if you're sending a wire, if you're remitting funds to family or somebody overseas, we all pay fees for all of that. That's a service that's provided, and the banks have provided that as a trusted service for many, many decades. But now with blockchain, the technology allows us to do that directly, peer to peer. We don't have to have an institution sitting in the middle facilitating that trusted transaction. It's now a trustless transaction over a global open source ledger that's basically free to use. I mean, there's some costs, but we're not going to spend $2 trillion a year moving digital assets around. That's a big part of the promise of blockchain, and it obviates a very big business line, particularly for correspondent banks. So I think the behavior we've seen from Jamie Dimon, from the big banks, where they've been very apprehensive to use this technology, it's business, it's predictable. They're protecting a business line. It's no different than how we saw the phone carriers be completely obviated by VoIP. I mean, if you remember, a big part of the internet debate and adoption and acceptance is paying long distance phone fees. It really wasn't that long ago, just a couple decades ago. Now I'm probably showing my age, but where if you wanted to call your grandma that lived out of state, you can only talk for a couple minutes because it's going to be a very expensive phone call. Right. Today, we don't have to worry about that. We don't pay we don't pay these long distance fees because we now have voice over internet protocol, and it makes it basically for free. And that obviated a very profitable business line for the phone carriers. Have gone, basically to zero at this point. So this is the consequence of technology. You have, old technologies that are going to be obviated. Of course, the companies that make money off of those services, they've got to deal with that and protecting their business, protecting their revenue lines. That's all fair business behavior, right? I don't think what's fair is then using your power and your clout to politicize a technology. That's quite damaging, but it is quite predictable. And that's why I decided to put my hat in the ring of this fight, because I thought this is obviously going to happen with Bitcoin. You're going to have a lot of companies that want to slow it down or aren't going to want to see it be successful. And I felt that this is a technology that's going to be good for humanity. It's going to provide more freedom and allow us to interact and transact in a more free way. And we should promote that. And so that's exactly what I've done. That's why I have been doing that with my career. And that's really what the fight comes down to. So can't blame the banks, but it has gotten a little out of hand with all the politics because it's just technology. Right. It can be used by anybody.
The technology is not partisan, right? We
understand
that the banking industry has its interest to protect, but disruption has come for all industries. And I do think there's a huge opportunity for them too in helping future-proof the American economy and build rails that are better, cheaper, faster, and proliferate the American economic opportunity around the world. So
actually, I thought about my answer. So if I had the opportunity to meet Jamie Dimon, it would be to help broker some deals for JP Morgan to buy some big crypto companies. So while the big banks have spent all this time demonizing the tech, I probably would have been a better use of time. Yeah, probably, they haven't built a lot of these systems. And at the end of the day, this is happening, right? We have a pro crypto president. the Genius Act has been passed. The Clarity Act is shortly behind. Wall Street's on board. All the brokerage firms are on board. It's really the banks are kind of the last standout of those to adopt it. And if you haven't been building these systems for the past 10 years, you're not just going to turn around tomorrow and expect to have crypto infrastructure. So I think I would talk to some of my friends like you, Nic, and other founders and CEOs in this space and see if we can get JP Morgan to buy some big crypto companies so we can start integrating this technology through the banking system.
All right. You heard it here first. Jamie, you got to give Perianne a call. Okay. So we actually interviewed a former Chancellor of the Exchequer on the podcast recently. So that's basically like Secretary Treasury here in the UK. And he was describing how challenging it is to get reforms passed. And one of the main obstacles was the lack of financial literacy in the institutions themselves. And he rated the quality of financial literacy in UK institutions, meaning like, sort of the public service organizations, at like a 2 out of 10. And so when you're trying to like convey the importance of adopting new protocols and staying current in the world, you're really fighting kind of almost a literacy challenge with institutions that have their own entrenched perspectives, but also are just quite unknowledgeable about how money works, how technology is developed, and all those things. What's been your experience in Washington, D.C. about financial literacy in general and on the Hill within sort of the lobbying groups, and then maybe some of the broader institutions, whether that's the CFTC, SEC, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing how many people really just don't understand how the banking system works and how the monetary system works. I recently set up a new bank account. I just needed to establish a new banking relationship, and I'm at the bank. I won't tell you which one, but it would be a name you've heard before. And I asked the woman who was setting up our new account, I said, hey, what do you guys do with the money? So if I'm going to deposit funds into my account, what do you do with it? And she really kind of looked at me kind of funny, like she wasn't very sure how to answer the question. And I said, well, does the money just sit in my account, or does the bank use it and put it to work and do things with it? And she said, oh, the money, it sits in your account. Your money is there. Your money is there. And I didn't correct her, but I just knew that she didn't actually understand. I mean, this institution that she works at, she does not understand what rehypothecation is, that the money is not just sitting there. You don't have full reserves. I don't even think we have any reserves at this point in the US, at least at the bigger banks. But most people don't know that. And I think more people that did understand what inflation is, and you talked about this earlier, how inflation is a hidden tax. I'd go so far to say that it's theft. It is theft of our own citizenry. And it's really amazing how much the system is built to put people in the dark about what's actually happening, about how the money actually works, what's actually happening in the system. The more people understood it, I think you would see a lot more action. And I think that's exactly what we have seen. That's why Bitcoin was created. In the Genesis block, there was a famous link to the chancellor on the brink of a bailout. So that was a nod to this is a new technology that is going to give people an option to opt into a different system that's not subjected to inflation and central economic planning. Bringing this back to DC and the policy conversations, DC has really gotten up to speed on crypto, digital assets, blockchain technology, the nuances between all of these terms. We do have a lot of extremely bright and smart people working on the policy. So it's we kind of have a less of an issue. That certainly was an issue when we were first getting started.
In the early days,
you first have to explain what Bitcoin is, that they'll even talk to you about it, and
it's internet money.
You can't really explain it in the 15 minutes they'll give you. So that has absolutely been quite challenging. But I think we have enough people in the right places, and I think that is a big impact of President Trump, where he's very clearly the pro-crypto president, and they put a lot of pro-crypto and crypto-educated and fluent people in the most important offices overseeing this technology. So we are having conversations of real substance today.
That's encouraging to hear. So right now, it feels like obviously like crypto and government are sort of always two sides kind of talking back to each other. And I think especially in some of the early adopters of this technology, those are huge reluctance to engage in conversation with regulators in general. And How do you feel about like bridging that gap so that some of the ethos of the technology is preserved while some of the concerns that, regulators, I think, legitimately have around consumer protections and enforcing laws are sort of integrated? So how do you facilitate that conversation? Because like a lot of people that obviously started in this industry, really were opposed to the overburdensome regulatory environment that they see has actually corrupted some of the opportunities for entrepreneurs to even interact in finance, for example. So how does that all get like threaded?
Yeah, and that certainly was the case for a number of years in the US, where I mean I would even tell companies I wouldn't recommend talking to the SEC because everything you say is just going to be used against you. That's changed. Again, having a pro crypto administration has made a huge difference where everything's not focused around enforcement. They're not focused on driving the industry overseas. They want the US to be the leader in this technology, and they're working with industry to help build a regulatory framework that's going to work for US businesses. So I think a big part of that lesson is the leadership, and the message has to come from the top. If you don't have your top leadership, and this goes for countries, it goes for other jurisdictions, states, local jurisdictions, and it also goes for corporations like banks, Wall Street firms. I mean, look at the difference between what's happening at JP Morgan with Jamie Dimon, who's very negative on Bitcoin, and then you have Abby Johnson, the CEO of Fidelity, that's been very positive on Bitcoin for many, many years, and just how much further ahead Fidelity is versus all of their peers because of that leadership that happened at the top. It's really a leadership issue. Leadership sets the tone. And if you have the right people in place who are driving a clear technical agenda, that has all the difference in the world for adoption and the direction of where these conversations go in Washington, in Wall Street, and in the conference room.
Yep. So, what keeps you optimistic about the future of crypto in the US, even after everything the industry's been through and your sort of front seat at the table there?
Right. So again, we went from being in this very defensive posture where the government was, we had Operation Choke Point 2.0. Everybody was losing their bank accounts. People were being kicked out of the country. Companies literally banished from operating here. We set the industry back a lot because of how the government was treating this technology, to how that's completely flipped to a very different and much more productive conversation. Even if the Clarity Act was not able to pass into law, and it is possible, it's not, that won't happen. We're obviously working very hard to make that happen, but we can't guarantee that. What is helpful is to have so many businesses going live with products and services. Once you have a financial market that's out there, once you have regulated products to market, it's really hard to unwind that. So the more companies we can get out to market, the more listed, regulated products launched, the more the market can move forward. It will be more difficult for the industry to be subjected to political winds. So that's something we certainly have going for us. And I really hope that this does not continue to be a political topic. That is my biggest fear. I do think part of Trump's agenda he's very much branded a part of his administration. His campaign was all about being pro crypto. That also leaves an attack vector. And we do see that the Democratic Party is still using the crypto as a means to attack Trump and to attack Republicans. And that's really bad for the industry. So it's really important that we're building those inroads of people on all sides of the aisle. It's really important that we're making sure everybody understands this is about technology. This is not about politics. Let's keep this out of politics, because that, to me, that is one of the bigger threats facing our industry today.
I agree. I think that's very problematic and arguably partially lethal long term. I mean, we all got into this because it didn't matter what color your skin was or where you were born or what gender you are. You were able to participate and transact with anybody you desired to. And I think there's some beauty in that. And it should always have been a bipartisan thing. And I think a lot of the work that you've done has sort of been leading in that way, which is building a big tent and making this the way we push forward, America's involvement in upgrading the financial system and doing it on rails that are open, transparent, and digital. And so I'm hopeful that the partisan aspects of that work, will not rear their ugly fangs. But yeah, time will tell. Okay, so we're going to come up to the sort of end of our chat here, but I wanted to know if there was like maybe one prediction you wanted to make about the future of digital assets that might sound a little bit bold today, but maybe be obvious in hindsight 5 years from now. And then maybe give us a little preview of anything you're interested in that you might be working on.
Okay, predictions. I don't like making price predictions, but I do think it's inevitable that Bitcoin's going to hit 1 million plus. I can't give you the date. I can't give you a specific timeline. But Bitcoin follows the laws of nature. It follows the power law. It's a network. It's growing as a network, and it's inevitable that we'll reach that level of scale. So that's what I'm waiting for, and what I look forward to.
In the meantime,
And
how are you going to spend your time besides the important work you do with the chamber?
yeah, and now where we are today, I've spent the first decade-ish of my career in the policy space, and now that we have, we're in a environment where we've accepted that this technology is here to stay, and we're really working with the regulators to implement the regulatory environment, landscape, the rules to the road. All of that is in motion and is going in a good direction. For me, the next frontier is, how do we bring this technology to the people that need it most? How do we get Bitcoin, stablecoins, cryptocurrencies, open source, permissionless systems in the hands of those who actually need it? And that's a huge education and outreach effort. And that's a big thing that I'm spending more time thinking about, and that I'm thinking through of, okay, now that we've kind of addressed the biggest risk, which was the policy risk, how do we bring it to the people? And so people interested in having that conversation, I'd love to have that with you.
Amazing. All right. Well, you can catch Perianne on Twitter for sure, among other spots. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating to hear about your perspective on where U.S. digital asset policy goes from here, including the colossal Clarity Act and what it could mean for the future of crypto in America, and how the relationship between industry and government needs to evolve and maintain collaborative and cooperative. So for our listeners, thank you so much for joining. Please subscribe to Block Party and leave a review if you enjoyed today's episode. So on behalf of the entire blockchain team, my name is Nic Cary, and thank you for tuning in.